At Public Assembly in Brooklyn during the winter of 2009, I delivered this lecture to a small audience of academics, artists, and a few friends. Functioning called the perichoresis maps music, art, and philosophy to 3 moments of dialectical becoming. An art life process, a way of striving, growing, a vehicle for living in and transmitting faith, hope, and love during an era when it is difficult to believe in structures that have historically activated this type of transcendence. For reasons which I'll explain, I've elected not to present that text today. Instead, I want to talk about a text I wrote 6 years ago called Transcendental Black Metal. There is virtually no account of our band written anywhere that does not begin by noting the controversy surrounding the lecture I gave in 2009. Thousands of comment threads and message boards overflow with text criticizing me in the most hateful terms. My lecture has become a legend, or at least a meme, a media phenomenon that can in some ways be usefully compared to that surrounding Bar Vickerness and the burning of the Fantostadt Church in 1992. Perhaps it goes without saying, or perhaps it doesn't, that this shaming and ridicule has been very painful to me, and that I feel profoundly misunderstood. I'm tethered to an imaginary personality with whom I cannot identify, an obnoxious, mean-spirited controversy baiter who lives in the minds of many music fans and journalists, and whose mission is to annoy them. The irony is that both my musical vision and my broader ideas and actions are completely sincere. I see this project as an instance of what Badu calls a truth procedure, an inspired, courageous process of suffering and faith in the name of universal love tied to a local becoming. I've wanted nothing more than to communicate and activate love, and yet for the most part I seem to have only brought scorn and hatred into the world. This disconnect between my intentions and the reaction I have received has led me to doubt myself. So I'd like to take this opportunity to give some background on the 2009 lecture, and to sincerely ask whether the act of delivering it was legitimate, or whether instead it was a mistake. The vision of transcendental black metal appeared to me several years before the symposium, in around 2005. At the time I was a philosophy student, playing in a few rock bands that rehearsed in Brooklyn, and almost in secret recording depressive black metal cassettes for myself in my dorm room. Though I was shy, I had a very wide and eclectic range of interests, various types of art, rock, metal, hardcore, electronic music, and so on, continental philosophy and psychoanalysis, especially the work of Nietzsche, Lacan, and Deleuze, and various eras of classical music, Wagnerian post-romanticism, French avant-garde spectralism, and especially American minimalism. I also had a budding interest in conceptual art, especially the work of Joseph Beuys. I felt myself to be on the verge of weaving all these threads into a performance, music, art, religion practice that would have redemptive power and epic scope. It's worth noting that during that time I was in constant pain, suffering huge levels of anxiety and paranoia, struggling against suicide. This pain in part had to do with a multi-generational tragedy unique to my family and personal life. But surely it also had to do with something more universal, the primordial wound, the out-of-joint character of human life, but in particular the contemporary horror vacui of those of us who are unable to integrate into a community with a collective spiritual practice, the bondage of isolation, self-obsession, and disconnection. The severity of this pain and confusion must be underscored because it was in the name of transcending it that liturgy was born. I yearned to create, as a dynamic work of art, a structure for overcoming the self-destructive forces that afflicted me, to synthesize a soul for myself, an aesthetic, symbolic system that I could use to overcome my state of bitterness and transmit, manifest, and live in faith. Unable to accept the religions that would provide the spiritual practice I so desperately needed, living in a society for which profound truth is disqualified and relativized by the leveling gaze of multiculturalism and political correctness, I would create my own structure, dangerous, subjectively invested, and uplifting. Around the age of 20, something clicked. In an epiphany, I realized that a reinterpretation of black metal could be the bedrock of this effort. Using the principle that what appears as the greatest source of affliction is precisely the best springboard into grace, I thought that I could reappropriate the music and mythologies of black metal, the soundtrack to my despair, to be a source of transcendence by using a particular element in a way its authors never intended, so as to create a short circuit. Out of the cauldron of my pain and my obsessions with philosophy, music, and art, a vision emerged. It didn't happen all at once. First appeared the idea of a new kind of drum beat called the burst beat, an ecstatic mutant variation of the blast beat. Soon after that came the term pure transcendental black metal, which is a variation on Darkthrone famous slogan, true Norwegian black metal. I hardly knew what it meant, but I knew it referred to an ethics of creation, resounding with American transcendentalism, or perhaps Deleuze's transcendental empiricism. I typed the slogan on top of an image of clouds from the internet, and it became the back cover of my first EP called Immortal Life. In the next few years, I began playing shows, first solo and then with the band. I yearned to complement the music with a symbolic declaration, something in the vein of Bataille's The Pineal Eye, or Artaud's The Theater of Cruelty, a cryptic, ecstatic vision of an eschatological limit. When I met Nicola Machandaro at a liturgy show, he told me about the symposium he was organizing, and I saw that I had a chance to do this. I composed the text itself mostly during November of 2009. It was the most inspired and excruciating process I've engaged in my life to date. I felt possessed. The presentation of the lecture was fairly low-key. As a moment for me, the symposium itself was a groundbreaking event, where credit for that goes to the person who organized it. Though I was the only participant who was in a band and had not gone to grad school, I think I more or less blended in. But soon enough, news of the lecture and the corresponding text spread on the internet and became a phenomenon, a bona fide scandal in the black metal community, which was in turn a source of fascination to journalists in the wider world. I did not expect the reaction to be so large, nor for it to be so negative. The easiest way to explain the phenomenon is as a miscommunication, in part due to the existence of the internet. The music was never directed at a particular audience. I didn't have any real connection to a metal scene. I lived my life as basically a hipster in Brooklyn. But the audience that picked up on Liturgy's music was for the most part the actual black metal underground itself. I wasn't really explaining myself, and much of the implicit subtleties of my act and music were ignored, or failed to communicate. I became a target for a more or less indiscriminate hatred. An idiot from New York talking about making good, happy black metal instead of bad, sad black metal. A symbol of the style being co-opted and going mainstream, which would eventually happen a few years later. But that answer is not adequate, and it ignores an important and well-known fact about human culture, the classic, even archetypal story of the reformer, the prophet who shines his light into the depths of truth, and then his surrounding community reacts violently, attempting to destroy him. The hero's journey, the rose cross, whatever name you want to give to the pursuit of embodied subjectivity, the suspension of both morality and pleasure in the name of a cultural unfolding of some kind, suffering in the name of truth. According to the story, a new idea or form appears, is at first misunderstood and creates a scandal, but ultimately marks the birth of a new movement. Surely the story of liturgy can be described in these terms to a degree. In 2009, liturgy was unprecedented. I was incorporating black metal into a sonic and cultural palette that was foreign to it, the sound world, an attitude of no-wave, post-minimalism, and shoegaze. Sonic Youth, Glenn Branca, Swans, and their more contemporary bands they influenced, like Erebon Radar, X Models, and Orthfilm. This was my world, where I really identified, and my incorporation of black metal was simply a new thing waiting to happen. people were mad at first and couldn't understand. But by now, in 2015, this aesthetic move no longer seems so strange. Though our new record is a different story, our older records are now accepted into the canon and recognized for what they are. The act of delivering the lecture and the text itself can be seen through the same lens in a way. I was returning to the romanticism invoked by so much black metal, but tracing it through the lineage of continental philosophy, marked by the names Nietzsche, Heidegger, Deleuze, etc., and putting it in the service of a radical politics of love. Let me be clear, I was not attempting to illustrate or allegorize any particular philosophical position, even though my lecture made use of Nietzsche's themes of active and reactive force and Lacan's opposition of desire and drive. This performance was meant to be an ethical act in Zizek's sense of the term, the instauration of a master signifier that has performative effect. Illegal, changing the terms of the debate, the master's lightning flash. Impossible to erase, perhaps unlocking new modes of power, initiating a fragile, meaningful quest, a Holy Spirit with no legitimacy other than the faith that sustains it. My name for this work of love that would follow in the wake of this act is the artwork, carried out at shows, in interviews on the internet, in an opera that takes place in real time, a drama whose narrative, rather than being scripted and playing out on a stage, is the career itself of a band, as it interacts with audiences, the music industry, and the internet across a series of albums. In short, instead of the blast beat, the burst beat, instead of burning the church in favor of racist neo-paganism, making a declaration in the name of the ethics of the real. I nevertheless feel I must take ownership of some major failures and flaws in execution. The same sense of isolation, self-obsession, and grandiosity that I have always been working to overcome has nevertheless reared its head at times. I was very awkward with unscripted verbal interviews. I have seen some that make me cringe just as much as the people who write invective in comment threads. I'm genuinely ashamed of these. They were mistakes. There were also issues with my bandmates, even though the musical vision and composition was all my own, more so in fact perhaps than most people realize. The other band members contributed their energy to the project, breathing power and life into it that I could not have on my own, something for which I have probably not been grateful enough. In addition, perhaps the form of the manifesto was a little too cryptic, a little too reverent toward the excesses of continental thought. It does in some ways needlessly resemble a translation of an untranslatable text from French or German. To recap, the creation of this strange scapegoat character, the pretentious, ridiculous Hunter Hunt Hendrix who swarms around the internet as a meme, can be explained in part as an unfortunate yet interesting misunderstanding. In part, it is the type of scandal that is ultimately testament to legitimate originality, and it can also be explained in part by my own hypocrisy. At some level, I perhaps deserve it. But beyond all these explanations, there is still a mystery, a surplus. I can't quite explain exhaustively the reason for the intensity of the hatred, especially given that the new liturgy record, which I thought would clarify the nature of the project and be a vindication, has caused even greater hatred and scorn. By the same token, though, I can't quite explain exhaustively my motivation for initiating this work in the first place. Surely that's because there is a process underway, a becoming that I do not understand. I'd like in the future, giving it a meaning that I cannot see yet. This is why I felt I couldn't go on and deliver another abstract, oracular, and mysterious text today. That would be a failure to engage authentically with the reaction. I want to sincerely listen and learn, to take the pain and disappointment as yet more material for purification, to own the stain and the failure inherent to my vision, and to perhaps, by grieving it, arrive at a new subjective position. Thus I thought that the best way to use the invitation to speak here, 6 years later, would be to make use of the shame I have experienced and to offer my vulnerability and sincerity with complete transparency and directness. To affirm the pain and remain sincerely engaged in the artwork. The legitimacy of a truth procedure is always impossible to verify. The key is to neither give up nor be dogmatic. At this point, I don't think I need the name Transcendental Black Metal. It is perhaps confusing. This project is better understood on its own terms at this point, without reference to black metal. But I think that my continued pursuit is in line with the terms that I laid out in my text. It is a dynamic struggle against the Hyperborean, exercising courage, openness, and honesty. This is in fact what I mean by the perichoresis of music, art, and philosophy, put into plain language. A music that aims sonically at transcendence, a philosophical effort to piece together a materialist ethics of faith, and an ever-renewed adaptive activity whose legitimacy is inherently impossible to establish, of suffering in the name of love.